Hey, welcome to the Proxy. My name is Phil Morse, and we are coming to you from CatchMark Studios in downtown Whitehall. I'm here to be your proxy by asking my guests questions that you may have regarding a topic. You can submit questions as well on the chat, and then I will answer them. Hopefully this conversation can contribute to your thoughts on this topic, because an examined opinion leads to discernment. On this episode today, I'm excited to have Lara, Bouse, and Deb Frisbee from the Michigan Kinship Care Coalition sharing their expertise on kinship. Thank you for being on my podcast, to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Please know that I try to think of questions that will help people understand this topic, in this case, kinship. And in some cases, I may ask questions that people don't necessarily agree with your position on. Now, this isn't necessarily a real controversial topic and today. This is more of an education kind of topic. It doesn't mean that I endorse or oppose your viewpoints or that I have these questions for myself. To my audience, make sure you remember to subscribe and click the notification button. I can only learn so much about a topic that's being covered. There may be some of you that have some great questions for these ladies that you can submit to the chat, and then I will ask those and these guys so they can share their wisdom. My hope is to build bridges and to tear down walls. So again, I'm glad to be here. Glad you guys are here. Could you give us just a little bit of background, each of you, that gives your credentials in the topic of kinship, so that we can know that what you have to say is from experience? We'll start with you, Deb.
Yeah, I am Deb Frisbee, and I work part-time for the Adoptive Family Support Network, better known as AFSN, and we are under the umbrella of DAB St. John's, DA Blodgett St. John's in Grand Rapids, and I became a kinship caregiver myself in 2004 and started in a guardianship. And so I have lived experience, and I love being part of the coalition to find out where we have gaps and things that we need to have changed.
Okay, thanks, Deb. How about you, Lara?
Well, I am the executive director of an organization called Fostering Forward Michigan, and we provide support, education, resources to all families that are working with children that have experienced adverse childhood experiences or some trauma in their childhood. Deb and I are both members of the steering committee of the Michigan Kinship Care Coalition. I came to Kinship Care. The first time I was approached about Kinship Care was 34 years ago, I was 2, or I might have been older than 2, but it was a long time ago, right? So I was very young, newly married, and approached about raising a relative's child, and I wasn't prepared to take on that. Over the course of these past 34 years, I have been a kinship caregiver 4 different times. I've been a licensed foster parent, and I have adopted children out of foster care. And now this is what I do. I advocate and look at policy and process here in the state of Michigan, provide advice to the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services teams, to other organizations, and then I also work at the national level with the National Foster Parent Association, Council of State Affiliates, all that kind of thing. So I believe I work harder now than I ever did when I was employed full time. Right, but I've got a lot of years under my belt.
Okay.
Talking about this good stuff.
Awesome, thank you. Now, there's people out there that are listening that may even be in a kinship situation that they didn't know they were in a kinship situation. So, or maybe not. Maybe people just don't understand what kinship is. So, if you could give us kind of a 30,000-foot view of the topic of kinship in this concept.
Kinship care is generally thought of as a household providing constant care and nurturing for a child that they did not give birth to or adopt originally, right? So you are a relative, generally caring for a child of another one of your relatives, either a grandchild or a niece or a nephew or a cousin or what have you. So kinship care is that care where families are providing care and nurturing for children they didn't plan on providing care and nurturing for, basically.
Okay. Well, so can you tell us a little bit about your organization too then, and how it relates to and what the efforts are? You said a little bit, but maybe dive into a little bit more what you do with that.
The Michigan Kinship Care Coalition. We are a coalition of many entities from across the state, including some partners within the Department of Health and Human Services, some of the sections and programs of MDHHS, and other organizations, some other programs under state government, and then many different nonprofit or other entities. Like we have some elder law people involved, Area Agency on Aging, community action agencies, lots of entities who touch the work with children and families and recognize that kinship care is an area where there are gaps and barriers to equity in resources and services available. So over many years of lots of us trying to do individual projects and trying to make things known, advocate, and create awareness, we ran into each other. All of these people, we all started running into each other and like, hey, we're doing the same kind of thing. We need to team up. We need to do this. We need to do that. So we did actually just create then this coalition of entities who are like-minded and agree that kinship care is something that needs more attention here in Michigan and across the country. And we're doing well. We're coalescing and we're making progress and we're doing things like this, making people aware of the efforts we're putting out there, and that, you know, we're willing to have help too. We're like, we don't have to be the only ones working on this. We'd be happy to have even more partners.
Okay, so in kinship, somebody may say, okay, or may be thinking right now, that's great. Kinship, somebody that's raising their own child, or somebody that's not their own child, they didn't expect to raise. Essentially is what that is, right? Kinship is.
Yep.
People are like, yeah, that happens. So, but what's the big deal? Why is there an organization? Why is there a movement? Why are there people talking about this?
So I'll speak to that. I started advocating at the state level with our legislators in 2014 and had Michelle Corey from Michigan's Children, backing what we're saying and what we wanted to do and raise the awareness of. And so what we really, at least when I was doing the work, was I entered the kinship world of raising 2 grandchildren under a guardianship. My children never entered the formal foster care system. And with that, there's a lack of services, there's a lack of financial aid, and there's just not the services that if you would have allowed your children to be in foster care, that would help you financially. It would get services for your children, for the ACEs, for the trauma, for everything that they've been through. And that's where we're trying to level the playing field, is to create equity between people who are coming into kinship care through court guardianships versus foster care.
So,
Can I?
Go ahead.
So what Deb is actually describing is something that we talk about in the informal kinship care. This is the hidden foster care. Kinship care also includes children in foster care that are placed with relatives, right? In Michigan,
All foster care.
there are less than 10,000 kids, a little more than 9,000 kids. Someplace bounces between 9,000 and 10,000 kids at a time in foster care. Only about 47% of those kids are placed with actual relatives of theirs, right? The rest are placed with unrelated licensed foster parents. But in Michigan, there are also 50,000 other children, 5 times as many as are in foster care as a whole, living in these informal kinship arrangements. Right now, they may have a guardianship, which is formal paperwork or power of attorney or whatever. And so it gets confusing for people, the difference when we talk about formal and informal, because some of these informal kinship family arrangements do actually have a guardianship in place or some court documents that give them some authority. Many of them do not, though. And that's where there's real difficulty with equity. If a grandparent knows that one of their children is struggling and grandchildren are being affected, and they step in and provide safety and security, that's fantastic. That's exactly what we want to have happen, right? It's best for children to be raised as close to their family of origin, their community of origin as possible. It's exactly what we want. But if that grandparent steps in, provides that safety and stability, they can go to court to get a guardianship. That has to be done voluntarily on both sides. The parent in the middle has to voluntarily enter into that guardianship. If they don't, then the grandparents, say when we talk about grandparents raising grandchildren, the grandparent then is in a contentious relationship with their own child for the safety of the grandchildren. And we don't want that contentious relationship to be there. If I or Deb have to go to court to fight our own child to keep grandchildren safe, we then don't have the ability or the luxury to be able to be a support and a resource for our child who is also suffering. So it completely messes with family dynamics and completely makes it next to impossible for you to truly support your sister or your child or your cousin or whoever, because you have to then look at the safety of the children and ignore the suffering of someone else that you love. And that's tragic. That's not how this should be done. In foster care, when kids come into foster care, if they're placed with a relative, the relative is caring for those children and can still provide some support through helping someone work through a case plan, right? There's a social worker involved. There's a case plan for reunification. The parent or the grandparent can continue to provide some supports and encouragement and resources while making sure children are safe. In these informal arrangements, that is much harder to do. So there is no social worker. There's no case plan. There's no nothing. If you go to court and you get guardianship, you're it. That's the end. But that parent can come back and ask for that guardianship to be canceled. And they can do that with you every year.
So with the informal version, what you're saying is it's a lot harder to parent that child then.
It's
right?
much harder. It's much harder. It's especially harder because, like you said earlier, a lot of these people don't know that they're kinship caregivers. They don't realize they fall into this bucket, that there's a term for who they are. They just think they're doing what they're supposed to do. But then when a child needs special medical treatment or a child needs special education services in school, then we have to look at whether or not they have the right paperwork in place to be able to consent to those things. If they do have everything in place and they can consent to those things, they've been out of the parenting game for a period of time. They don't understand all the new stuff, right? All the new processes and resources, and they don't know that they should even think of the word kinship or mention kinship care in any way. When people mention to them that they're possibly kinship caregivers, that doesn't mean anything to them either, because the awareness isn't out there. We don't talk about kinship care. So people don't really, it doesn't ring true for them. They don't know where to even start to look for resources and help. They're completely out in the dark by themselves. No one's holding their hand.
And that's where I always felt the gap in service was, because when you know that your grandchildren, there might be, and their safety might be in jeopardy, or they're in a home with domestic violence and they're seeing things you don't want them to see. Maybe CPS hasn't even been involved yet. Maybe there hasn't been a report. What grandmother wants to step back and just hold on until something egregious happens?
Right. Wait for CPS to step
and
in.
wait for CPS to
Right.
step in. And so, that's one of the big things. That's the scenario. The other thing is that it's a knee-jerk reaction, even if CPS does get involved, because we're trying to raise awareness, because those people are given very little information at the beginning of this process, and believe me, it's a big process when CPS becomes involved. And if the kids are, if it's not egregious enough to remove the children formally, then sometimes these families, adult children, are told to, do you know someplace safe where you can, who will take care of your children? And they'll say, yeah, I think my mom and dad will do it, or I think my brother or sister will do it. And so they present that to the brother or sister like, I'm in trouble, or I don't have any housing anymore. And of course, grandma's going to say yes. Of course, auntie or uncle are going to say yes and come to the rescue. That's the knee-jerk reaction, because after that, there's no information given to them other than they tell them, go to the court and get a full guardianship.
So I'm glad you said that. So what are the different scenarios that are out there that creates these 90,000 kinship situations where they're informal? So, for example, you came up with a scenario where it's a grandma that sees that their child is getting sexually, abused or whatever. So that's one scenario. So basically, an extended family member is concerned about the child's well-being. Mm-hmm. What are some other examples of scenarios that create this situation? And not specific, just general. Am I making any sense with my question?
Well, yeah. Anything you can think of that you might, when you're sitting at home for a moment, thinking of a situation with a child in your family that might make you feel as though that child is in a situation where they are not safe, there's not stability for them. It might be possible for safety and stability to happen, but the parent of that child needs some extra help, right? Those are the scenarios. So it could be anything. It could be abuse and neglect. It could be the type of neglect that happens when we have an addiction or a substance use problem, right? It could be the kind of thing that happens when we're in a domestic violence type relationship, a power and control cycle. We don't know how to protect ourselves, so we also then don't know how to protect our own children. It's any of those kinds of situations that a grandparent or a parent or an aunt or an uncle or a sister or somebody would see and say, well, wait, I'm going to try to help with this, right? And so you might approach your sister and you might say, hey, I see this is going on. I know you're struggling, you're having some difficulty. Why don't you let the kids come stay at my house, for a couple days or what have you? And that works pretty well. And then something else happens, and now CPS is involved, but CPS doesn't have what they need to substantiate, to create a petition to remove those children from the parents' care. But they know that there's still risk of harm, that there's still something going on. So a CPS worker will say, like Deb said, is there somewhere else where these kids can go to be safe while you work on these couple of things that are keeping you from providing the best possible care for your children?
So what's the problem that's being created there then? It's the financial element of
that
things.
there are no supports. And then if it happens in a voluntary way without any court oversight, right? Then it's not just financial, though dollars are important when we talk about cost of living these days, and we talk about who you are stepping in to raise someone else's children. In Deb's case, she took on 2 grandchildren, and she and her husband had to make a choice for Deb to take an early retirement to become a stay-at-home mom again. their retirement now looks very different than it would have if she'd worked for another 15 years, right? So it's not just the dollars. It's the fact that there's no longer a path or a person, there's no navigator or social worker or person involved to help this family navigate the family dynamics that have gone a little bit haywire now, understand the difference between safety and stability and then moral opinion, right? Because that happens between generations also. And then there is a lack of clear and concise places to go to get help if you don't necessarily need to, or you're opposed or afraid of the stigma of signing up for any type of social welfare programs, right? So if you, we can all go to Salvation Army or Goodwill and buy clothes, right? Slightly used clothes and that kind of thing. And a lot of us do that. It's not a problem. At some point, things become more than what you know how to handle on your own. And there isn't a good place right now that we can point to and say, that's who you call, that's where you go, this is how you get help when you've gotten yourself into this kind of a situation.
And
Whether you created the situation or not, this is where you are now. This is how you get some help. There is no help.
Right. Foster care has that. They have the navigators. They have the supports in place. And the informal kinship care like mine with just a full guardianship. And I have to say, you know, we don't know what age we're going to get our children at. So I got a baby and I got a 3-year-old. The 3-year-old was meeting all of his milestones until I started seeing some gaps. And then the older he got, the bigger the gap. And then the bigger the behaviors got. And so when I was reaching out for help, I thought I could call the Post-Adopt Resource Center, who is a national level?
It's statewide program. There are Post-Adopt Resource Centers across the country,
statewide,
it's a statewide program.
Statewide program. But they couldn't help me because I didn't adopt.
From foster care.
From foster care.
She adopted after the guardianship. Right. So we do have in Michigan, it's not to say that there aren't any supports for kinship caregivers at all. It's that the majority of kinship caregivers, 50,000 of them, don't know they're kinship caregivers. And so how do we reach those people? The MSU School of Social Work does run the Kinship Care Resource Center. They do some excellent work there, and they're doing some evidence-based pilots right now. I mean, we're really encouraged about what they're doing. The Department of Health and Human Services does support that program. That's where it came from. It's a contract under their umbrella. They do great stuff. But if people don't know that they're kinship caregivers and they don't know that that's the place they can go to talk to somebody on the telephone who will give them a local resource and say, hey, we have a list of support groups. Here's one in your area or within 20 miles. You could talk to other people raising relative children, or here's where you might go, you know, to find some assistance or what have you. If people don't know how to get to the resources because they don't even know they need them or they qualify for some sort of resources, that's our biggest gap. That's our first problem. The other thing that's a difference between these informal care arrangements and foster care is foster children, the minute they become a foster child, they have Medicaid. The minute they become a foster child, the people caring for them are receiving some sort of daily reimbursement for food, meals, clothing, all the stuff you need to raise a child. Raising a child is not, it's not an inexpensive endeavor, right? And if you are not prepared, you have not planned for this was not what you thought you were going to do with your years, you can very quickly deplete your savings. In Michigan, we have grandparents that have second and third mortgages on their homes, right? Wow. They have no retirement. They have drained their 401k. They have taken an early retirement and lost out on Social Security dollars. And it is a huge strain on a family to take on 1 or 2 or 4, or in some cases 6 children, right? Siblings that you weren't planning on raising.
So, and just a quick reminder, if you want to make a comment or actually a question is the main thing. If you have a question for these ladies, now's the time to put that in the chat, under in the YouTube chat here. Just remember too, if you don't want to put your name on it, you can log out of your YouTube account or Gmail account and then put the question in and it will show up as anonymous. So why don't people just then give their children up for adoption? Or why don't they, so that they get these benefits?
It's a great question.
Well, number one, because I can give you an answer on both sides of that, right? But Deb and I can approach all of that. But the last thing we want to do is encourage family members to abandon their family members, right? And leave them without any family connections, without any of that inherent culture and community that comes with being related to other people. The last thing we want to do is increase the roles, the foster care roles, or the children available for adoption in the state of Michigan. We don't need those numbers to be any higher. We can keep foster care between 9,000 and 10,000 kids. That's pretty good, because some years ago we averaged at 15,000, right? We're doing better. We are doing better. We want to continue to do better. I would love to see us find a way in the course of my lifetime to put myself out of business, to not have to worry about foster care except for in the most egregious situations. And I'd like there to be less and less egregious situations. That comes with more public awareness, more public education, making sure people understand what it is to raise a child, making sure people understand what it is to help a child cope and survive a trauma of some sort or something that they've experienced, right? We know, Deb and I know, we probably aren't going to make that happen. The two of us and our handful of friends are not going to make that happen in Michigan or anywhere in this country where children just have a wonderful existence, every single one of them, right? That's not realistic. We would hate to think that it would be better to abandon a child and allow them to be adopted by others, by strangers. Legally, adoption or termination of parental rights legally severs all familial relationships.
So if
there's no visitation.
So the key thing is that they can go back with their family. They get straight. They get their life figured out. The parents of the grandmas, kids,
sure,
are getting things figured out. Their life turned around. So now that adoption, it's no longer severed. Is that an accurate description?
Well, no. I mean, once a child's adopted,
if they don't go through adoption.
If they,
right.
if
it's a lot less legal battles and
right? Absolutely,
right.
And there's so much more psychological and physiological benefit to a child staying in their community, their culture of origin, that family of origin.
So how about an
There's
adoption?
nothing we want more than our adult children to have their children back.
Right.
Absolutely.
And our children want to be back with their parents more than anything in the whole wide world. And so, and when you talked earlier about, when grandpa and grandma can't do this anymore, why don't they just, give them up, to be foster children? Once you sign that legal guardianship paper for full guardianship, you can't rescind that yourself. You can't say, I can't do this anymore. Although there are some grandparents, because of the lack of support,
they have to do that.
I don't know how I'm going to do this anymore. I don't know how I'm going to pay my propane bill. I don't know how I'm going to feed 2 hungry teenagers. We live in northern Michigan, and I'm telling you, we're driving some of these families deeper and deeper into poverty, and they stepped up to the plate to care for these children, to keep them out of foster care, and we're not giving them what they need. And we don't know what they need because every family has
different
is
set
unique.
of needs. Right.
I didn't need financial aid when I got my grandchildren in 2005. But now my daughter's 19 and I'm on a fixed income, and I don't know how she's going to go through college without having to work, without having to figure it out, because we just don't have the funds to do that.
Is there something in the system, and somebody may wonder, is there something in the system that if you give your child up for an adoption that a family member has first dibs?
So yes and no. If you abandon your child or rescind your parental rights to your child, then your relatives can ask for placement of that child. Your child goes into the formal foster care system, the Department of Health and Human Services, and all of its contract agencies are bound to look for family members first, for relatives first. Absolutely. So sure, a relative could step up and say, hey, I'll raise that child that's now in foster care. That's wonderful. But that child became a foster child through abandonment rather than through any other reason of abuse or neglect. That child didn't need to be abandoned. Mm-hmm. We need to find a way to provide resources and supports to that family of origin.
So psychologically, you're saying to that child,
it's horrendous.
That's traumatic.
It's absolutely horrendous. Yep. Yes, it's absolutely horrendous.
So let's get into the solution.
Sure.
If you had let's start. First I'll ask you what the magic wand solution is. If you had all the resources you were in the legislature and you were all 110 of them and you were the governor and you were the 38 senators and you could make one decision and you had the magic wand. So I'm going to ask you that. And then what's an actual realistic doable priority for you right now? Mm-hmm. So let's start with the magic wand approach. What's the solution?
Well, Deb mentioned the magic wand earlier already. The magic wand would give us the ability to create equity so that every child in the state of Michigan was valued in the same way. Every single child. Mm-hmm. Every single child's existence would be supported in a way to make sure that they had safety and stability and the resources that they need to be successful.
So what does that look like policy-wise?
What does that look like policy-wise?
Yeah, how does that look?
It might look like dollars spent on creating resource centers or building into the family resource centers that are being piloted and created now by Michigan Children's Trust Michigan. It might look like spending some more dollars there and putting a dedicated kinship support person in each one of those family resource centers, somebody that can, when someone walks in the door or calls and says, this is what I've ended up, I've got 3 grandkids living with me, I don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. Somebody that they can get their hands on that is regionally appropriate or local to them, that they can have some trust in. It means finding a way to build programs and create resources that are the trusted partner for children and families in the state of Michigan, no matter who they are, without the need for egregious acts against a child. Just plain, every single kid should be allowed to grow up with safety and stability. And if that means you need $1,500 a year, then you get $1,500 a year. Deb might only need $200. Mm-hmm. So let's help her meet her need. But kids need to be treated equally. Kids need to have equal value. They don't right now.
And so that would be determined by, like, for example, Deb's family gets $200, my family gets $1,500. That would be determined by income and what's in their bank account, essentially?
It may be.
Okay.
We may need to help Grandma get an egress window,
right?
So
she can have an additional
kids are,
bedroom.
Safe in something that probably wasn't designed to be a bedroom,
right?
So it's going to look different for every family, and that's why we have to have these designated centers just for kinship families.
Designated staff.
Right, designated staff, so that we can wrap around whatever it is that they need. Now, in Benzie Manistee, we're working in a work group to try to create a pilot program there, and they have a wonderful human service collaborative that says, oh, man, yeah, we need exactly what you're talking about. And that's DHHS saying that. That's, the health department saying that. That's, community mental health saying that. And they're all saying, yes. And what would that look like? And so when we may wave the magic wand, we're saying, would you appropriate some money in the budget to allow us to do 3 pilot programs, maybe one urban, one rural like ours, and, whatever other area you want to hit. So, I mean, there's a lot of ask. One of the asks that I said was, your grandparents are stepping up to the plate, or relatives are stepping up to the plate to take the grandchildren. They're going to court. You tell them to file for a full guardianship. It's $175. Should they have to pay for that? Or could we find a way?
Do they have to pay for the privilege of raising a relative they didn't plan on raising?
Right.
Right.
They're not going to be, in formal foster care. I'm going to do this, but, and they don't even know that. These are the things that I know that I want to help change for all those families. The opioid crisis is, kids are going to come into care every day. The opioid crisis is not going away. And we know that there are funding sources through Title IV or whatever.
Right.
And
all the titles, all the titles have money. All of them have money.
I started talking to my county commissioners saying, hey, I know opioid money is coming in, and I know that a lot of money is going to go to rehab centers, but what about the ripple effect and the grandparents who are raising grandchildren?
Right.
And the county commissioners said, you're right. You're right. I know.
Right.
I know we have them here in this county.
Right. And I think one of the other things that when I point to this kind of a question is there are a lot of programs that are available for grandparents and for others raising kids. There's a lot of programs. Everyone has different eligibility because of however the funding was created, that kind of thing. That the point I like to make, completely self-serving, truly, but is true. I am 54 years old. Area Agency on Aging dollars and programs for grandparents, you are not eligible until you're 55. I have been considered a kinship caregiver for 34 years, and I'm not eligible yet to apply for any dollars to get any help. That's insane, right? So that's what we're talking about as far as equity for these children, these families. We're at 54 years old, having raised children of many different ages over the past 34 years, I can now claim great-grandchildren at 54.
That was a point I was going to make.
Our
grandparents
are younger now. Grandparents are younger. We can't wait. Our grandparents, if a grandparent at 37 years old needs help raising their grandchildren, they can't wait until they're 55, right? So those programs are flawed. They exist for aging adults, and so maybe those programs aren't the programs we go to for this, but we have to point to that and say, hey, that isn't a program where there's eligibility. Where is there a program for eligibility?
So what is the barrier? What's keeping this magic wand, these policies from being passed into law?
Well, I think the biggest barrier is awareness. I think every time Deb and I have been to Lansing or anywhere else speaking publicly on this, we meet new people who did not realize they grew up with a kinship care situation happening in their family. We met legislators last May who said, I was raised in a home with my cousins. My parents took in my cousins. I didn't know there was a name for that. You probably wouldn't have known about that. The kinship care is a term that was only coined 30 years ago. It's a brand new term in the lifetime of policy and law and practice in this country. It's only been around for 30 years. And we're here telling you about it today. And you have a background in education and education administration, and you didn't know, right, that kinship care was this big of a thing. You didn't know before we got here or before we spoke that there's 50,000 children in kinship relationships, but 54,000 children, truly, 4,000 of them are in foster care. 50,000 of them are outside of the system and don't have the supports and services that a wonderful, helpful, social worker could provide. They
The-
don't have someone to walk a path with them.
And that's an estimated number because in
Yep.
2019, that came from the census, and I think the Annie Casey Foundation and
Generations
Generations United took that off from the latest census because the census asked a question that they probably had never asked before. And it only happens every 10 years. So they did ask a question on the census. I don't remember exactly how it was worded, but were you raising, children without any parents in the home or something like that? I wouldn't even have been on that census because I adopted my grandchildren, so I no longer look like a kinship caregiver.
Not on paper. Right.
Not on paper.
Right.
And I think, one of the other things that, I talk with legislators about way back in 2018 or 19, I gave testimony and I said, the state of Michigan doesn't know what the state of Michigan is in because they don't have the data.
They don't have numbers.
I just talked to someone who works in with standards for AAA, the Area Agency on Aging, within DHHS, and I said, you have to start asking on your form when you're doing an intake for anybody for AAA. I don't care if they're coming because they want to take a dance class.
Right.
You have to ask that question. Are you a relative caring for children that are not that are not yours? And then I don't know if kinship care has to be in parentheses to begin with,
Maybe.
to start so that they, put the relation with relative and kinship care and put the two of them together. But it, that's troubling to me because Lara got some statistics from the because we've been working hard to try to figure out where can we get numbers. Now, who would know this? Well, school would, because you have to enroll your children, right? So if they come in under a power of attorney or a guardianship, the school should have that record. Nope. And then we thought, well, the court should have that record. So I went to a judge in Mason County and said, could you tell me how many guardianships are in Mason County? And he said, well, let me check into that. So he got back with me and he said, I can't give you an exact number because all guardianships are lumped together. So that would be a conservatorship. It would be the juvenile guardianship. It would be everything. And all he could tell me is that I can tell you that the vast majority of them are juvenile guardianships. And for this small county, there's a lot.
Right.
So there may be some people out there. I'm going to play devil's advocate just a little bit here. That's what the proxy kind of does too. There may be people out there that say, well, these grandparents or these aunts, these uncles that take these kids on, and I know some people myself. There's some people that come to mind for me that are raising their grandkids, or at least mostly, or whatever, And they just say, well, you just got to take one in the chin. Those families got to take one on the chin for the team. It's out of our control that their child got into drugs or whatever. How would you respond to that?
I'll respond to that because
I'm ready.
I'm sorry that there's that bias there because people truly who haven't been touched by any opioid addictions or trauma to their children or their grandchildren have truly been blessed. And I think that the other thing that I tell legislators is that if we don't start, you want us to take it on the chin, but if you don't start supporting the families who are doing this, you're going to pay for it in the end. Because my son's behaviors got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I had to reach out to police departments. I had to reach out to hospitals. I had to reach out to many things. And if we don't support those families, those kids are going to become part of the juvenile justice system, and they could be sitting on our jails. And try to rehab them after that.
Right.
And our schools don't understand our kids. My son had an invisible disability with fetal alcohol syndrome. It is brain damage, and you can't change that. And he had a target on his back because he had big behaviors, because he had no impulse control. And so the kids ostracized him, and then the principal was after him all the time, to the point where I think that's where a lot of my advocacy work started because I had to advocate so hard for him. So I'm saying we can't take it on the chin, you know? Well, there's a lot of people that don't want the state involved, and they don't want, they don't need it. I mean, I have a grandmother that I have coffee with, and she says, I don't need any services right now. And she has a grandson who's 10, and she feels so full of gratitude, that she's there. So, I'm saying to the legislators, yeah, there's 54,000 kids out there, but not everybody wants that.
Right.
But we do have to take care of the ones who do. At least we have to check in with them and say, can you handle this? Do you know what you're getting yourself into? So I always said that gap is because CPS does an investigation. It doesn't warrant a removal, but it does warrant, checking into getting the kids in a better place. And at that point, there's no communication anymore. And I can't stress that enough, that there's no communication. There's no CPS telling DHHS to go in and, talk with grandma and, see if this is an okay situation with her, tell her that she might have to, does her house meet standards and, all that kind of stuff. That all happens if you go into the formal foster care. It does not happen if you come in the informal system.
Well, and I would say too, I mean, take it on the chin. I get that. I'm a taxpayer too. Deb's a taxpayer. I don't really want my dollars spent on things where it shouldn't be spent, or I think it's frivolous or what have you. But I mean, is it really fair for myself or for Deb or any one of these other thousands and thousands of people to step in and start raising a child they weren't prepared to raise, and then be told, oh, that kid's related to you, so that's your problem. Oh, those 6 children are related to you, so they can just be your problem. At what point is it no longer my responsibility to possibly raise every single descendant of mine in some way, right? Or every single relative of mine in some way? Is it really, is giving up your retirement, putting a second mortgage on your home, cashing in your 401k and taking penalties and that kind of thing, is that taking it on the chin? Or is that altering your life so drastically that you don't know how to come back from that? At the same time, you're in crisis trying to figure out how to help somebody survive what they have experienced and the trauma of this transition, being separated from the only people they know as their adults. Like, I just can't take it on the chin. I get it. I get that that's out there. I've heard it before too. But really, at $500,000 gone from your 401k and a second mortgage on your home, that's taking it on the chin. I'd rather buy one person a Happy Meal once a week and I'd call it a charitable donation. Like, it's insulting is what it is.
So just for the sake of time, I'll ask a question. So essentially what you're hoping for is a system before they hit the system.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
Before they hit before they hit foster care, before they have to be a part of the foster care system, we would really like to be a part of building a system and a path to resources that anybody can access when they need to.
So do you have numbers on that? Do you have numbers on how much the foster care system costs right now? And I'm sure, do you have those numbers?
Well,
I know it's complex. I'm sure there's a lot.
I didn't do that fancy math because that kind of math is exhausting. Those numbers do exist, and I didn't pull that data. I can tell you that on average, a foster child that has no extra needs, where there's no added effort to raising this child. They don't have to go to therapy and all kinds of other things. They don't need interventions 4 days a week, etc. A fairly average child in foster care costs someplace between $21 and $26 a day in reimbursement. Some of those kids, based on eligibility requirements, and some of those kids, those dollars are reimbursed by the federal government. Some of them are county and state funded, right? It's not every child is eligible for the Title IV funding reimbursements from the feds. But if we were to just look at the dollars, even if it was $30 a day for every single kid in foster care, and we did round numbers at 10,000 kids in foster care, $30 times 10,000 a day, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about real dollars. That's the reimbursement rate to a licensed foster parent. That's not all of the costs, because there's social workers' salaries, there's all kinds of administrative costs, there's Medicaid, there's all those things, right? Like the numbers become astronomical for 10,000 kids. We have 50,000 kids. They're in the exact same boat that aren't getting anything, except maybe the TANF that Deb was talking about, temporary assistance for needy families, where you can apply for that once you have guardianship. It is $158 a month for the first child, and for each subsequent child on your case, it is less per child per month. There is no way we're anywhere close to equity. There's no way.
So is this system before the system, I'm guessing, would cost, have you ever estimated that? Like to your magic wand?
No, not
answer.
overall. What
Okay.
no.
I guess my question, the reason I'm asking is, would it be a fraction of the cost of the current system? Like
Absolutely.
the system? The
Absolutely.
And what do you, 10% of the cost, 20%?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think I could answer that with a really good number and then be held to it. Of course, it's not my checkbook, so I guess I don't have to
right.
be held to it. But no, it would be a fraction of the cost. Just like any of these, any program we put in place that is preemptive rather than rehabilitation, or it's going to cost less, right? That if we don't spend the money, like Deb said, if we don't spend the money up front and we don't get these kids and these families the supports and things they need, the damage continues, the trauma continues. It becomes compound and complex and exponential, and then all of a sudden we have somebody in adulthood who doesn't know how to feel safe in their own skin, who doesn't know how to make or reason out a decision, and they become desperate and living only on survival skills in their amygdala, living only on survival skills and making choices that they really aren't thinking through. They're not making a choice. They're just plain doing the thing they know how to do to survive. And that then creates prisoners. And prisons make money, right? Spending money up front costs us some money now, but we have less people in prison later. Mm-hmm. But putting more people in prison, there is somebody at the end of that chain who owns stock or owns that prison system who gets paid for housing these people that we didn't need to go there.
Well, last question.
Yep.
We didn't really answer my second question, doable priority right now that can be done in this legislative session, 2023-24. Any ideas of what's something that tangible victory that you guys can have?
There are asks. The Child Welfare Improvement Task Force, which I am also a part of here in Michigan, put some recommendations forth with our legislative partners to fund and expand the dollars used for the Kinship Advisory Council, which is a council that MDHHS set up when some bills to create it under law got tie-barred and then failed due to partisan politics. right? The department saw the need for this Kinship Advisory Council. They created it and they put into boilerplate some dollars to start it, but it has not actually been funded in a way that it can do any additional like real work. It can't run a pilot program. It can't pay people to do additional research and that kind of thing. There's not a full-time research staffer for the Kinship Advisory Council. So while it is an amazing council with a great and diverse group of members who really want to do this work and focus on this work, it is tied to, we can only go so far because we're going to run out of dollars at some point. It's boilerplate language allowed for $200,000 annually for this Kinship Advisory Council.
So the answer
That's not
is
a lot
to
of
fund
money.
that.
Let's fund that. The Child Welfare Improvement Task Force put that ask through. We're working with our legislative partners to try to get that funded. Beyond that, the Michigan Kinship Care Coalition did send recommendations over to the Department of Health and Human Services about their fiscal year 2023, which we're in now, fiscal year TANF programming, about all kinds of things that we think can be done, adjusting the TANF program and the TANF budget here in Michigan to begin pilots and begin expanding resources and access to dollars for the families that need the access to the dollars. Things that are not horribly expensive. Like if you're receiving TANF, $158 a month, and the person you took guardianship from, right? The parent of the child was ordered in the guardianship to pay child support, and they pay child support 1 month, that makes you either ineligible for TANF or you may have to pay some TANF money back because the child support offsets that TANF. So if I have grandchildren and my child was ordered through guardianship to pay me child support and the court forwards to me $30, that $30 offsets the TANF money I received. And if that happens enough there's enough dollars, you become ineligible for TANF. They deny you, they cut it off, you have to reapply when that kid stops paying child support. That's insanity.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Deb, for being here, and Lara, I appreciate your time. We could talk probably for a long time.
We could
It's
do
very
this.
complex.
Deb and I could do this for 6 months, every day for 6 months.
I
and
always
teach you
say I'm
something
going to
new.
feed you with a fire hose.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Well, I hope you guys join us next Thursday when we talk about military and the possible reform that some people have ideas of military reform. And you submit your reasonable questions and comments so I can act as your proxy. We're going to be talking with Lieutenant Colonel Chris Mulder, who actually works in the Pentagon, and we'll be zooming in. He'll be zooming in next week on a video conference. So I'm looking forward to that, just like we had our time today. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification button so you could get the little bell rings whenever it's our time to meet again. And I'll see you next time, and I hope you build bridges and tear down walls.
Awesome.